Yes. So I said, it must be nice to be on a ship like this after the Carrollton. And he said, not as much as you might think. He said, the Carrollton would beat you up, but she'd bring you in. Then he walked away. I finally concluded that he didn't trust that ship. I reported all of this at the Board of Inquiry. I told him about this. And then one more little thing I put.
Real quick, Cap.
I talked about, when I was describing this to the Board of Inquiry, this admiral kept asking me these questions. I wasn't prepared for this when I went there. He kept asking me all these questions about this bending and flexing and all that. For the lack of a better explanation, I said, well, it was like a diving board after somebody jumped off in its vibration. 10 years later, I picked up a report by the Coast Guard, and of course, they used better words than I did. Springing and vibratory stresses. That admiral was very, very interested in that, and he kept pursuing it. And I've been on that witness stand like 3 hours, you know, so we found out that what I saw there, that short time that I was there as third mate, we got a lot of knowledge out of that. It took years for it to come to the surface, but we did. And McSorley didn't trust the ship, and nobody could believe that either. But that's the way it was, and we really did see it. And we saw a potential problem there. I never give it another thought, you know, but until after she sunk, then I thought. Anyway, that's what McSorley was aware that he had a problem there. No question about it.
Thank you, Cap. Thank you very much. I could listen to this captain talk all night, quite honestly. When we talk about the scenic route, leaving out of Superior, Wisconsin, all the way up, he had a choice to make at Isle Royale. They knew the storm was coming. Captain McSorley knew his weather, like all good captains do. They had a choice. They could stay here, wait out the storm, as several ships did. They opted to take the northern route. That's because the waves blowing from the northwest at 60 miles an hour would build this entire expanse of Lake Superior. So farther the fetch, the bigger the waves get. This is the worst place that they'd want to be on the Great Lakes. But Cooper of the Anderson, McSorley, as they came up here, made a call. Do they go for it? And they mistimed the storm. The storm came through Marquette faster than they expected. And by the time they came down past Caribou, past Michipicoten, they got hit in what was the worst part of the storm. There was no escaping at that point, and the ship obviously ripped in part and went down. Can we go to the next level? Zug Island, the final. Gordon Lightfoot said fully loaded for Cleveland. It was bound for here. A couple things he got wrong. This is where they launched from in Superior. These are the ore docks. You've probably seen these if you've been to any of the port cities like Marquette. This is how they load with the big train cars, and it's gravity fed into the ship. Go ahead and go to the next one. This is the storm coming in. It's kind of hard to see on this one, so I won't go too much into depth. Go to the next one. Another zoom in as the low pressure system went past Lawrence and came in, and as these isobar measurements got closer together, heavier winds, 60-mile-an-hour winds that came in, which happen almost every year on the Great Lakes, quite honestly. On Lake Superior, we see that at Standard Rock every season. So was it out of the ordinary? Not really. I see a lot of the talk about the storm. It certainly was a big storm, but compared to the great storms we've seen, it wasn't that incredible of a storm. Here's the area where they came through. A lot of the people have talked about Chummy Bank or the 6 Fathom Shoal. The Coast Guard investigator I talked to said this is just a misprint, that this is it's supposed to be 16 instead of 6, and that the Canadian survey ship, the Bayfield, went out there, searched that area. I talked to members of that crew, and they found nothing. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how this ship ran aground, and Roscoe and I will argue and argue until the cows come home about whether or not that ship came close enough to here, but it suffices to say that none of the Coast Guard investigators believe that it came anywhere close to this shoal. And because I dove the Fitzgerald and saw the entire upside down stern section, 250 feet of stern section, I went over the entire top. There's not a scratch on it. So to think that it hit on the bow and somehow didn't damage the stern, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. There's no evidence other than Cooper, as he looked at the radar, as they went through this area, said, that ship is in closer than I'd like to be. And that's where all of this came up. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that came up. Let's go ahead and why this theory was so popular. Here's the ship. They did talk, as they went through around 3 o'clock, McSorley said there was some damage on the freighter, that the rail was down. We don't know what rail it was. I've seen it written port. I don't know where people get that. I've never seen that there was actually a report of which one it was. And he said he had a vent missing. These white tops here are the vents that equalize the pressure within the ballast. If one of those gets ripped open, water will come in, but everybody argues, would that be enough water to flood? Would it be enough to sink it? The Coast Guard eventually would say it was actually the hatch clamps on each one of these hatches. There's 22 of these hatch clamps. And when they took off on Sunday, it was common practice, because it was a weekend and it was union work, it was expensive, that they would just dog the corners, and it was a beautiful, sunny day. So they dogged these corners. There's 96 clamps on each one of these hatches. So there's 2,112 of those hatch clamps on here. And people argue with me again, Rick, there's no way the crew went out there with these hatch clamps not all dogged down. But the truth is, when you look at the shipwreck, there's clamps that look like this, like C-clamps, and there's clamps that are stretched out like this. The ones that are stretched out are where the hatch blew off. The ones that still stay intact are the ones that weren't dogged down. And to this day, I go to the Sulaks, I look at freighters going through, and they're still not dogging all. I have pictures of it. People still don't dog all the hatches. Now again, is that why it sank? Probably not. But there's been a lot of talk with Gordon Lightfoot changing the song about putting blame on because he didn't like the fact that they said, well, they weren't dogged. Well, the truth is, there's no blame, but they weren't dogged, I'm telling you. Go ahead. Here's the Arthur M. Anderson behind the Edmund Fitzgerald. Once they reported their problems, they also said we have radar out. And they were worried because there were several saltwater vessels that were at Whitefish Point, and they were worried that they were going to head out into the storm, and the Fitz had 2 radars on there. Both were out. They couldn't see anything into the storm. So the Fitz called the Anderson and said, would you please look at your scope? I'll close the distance. You tell me what's happening with those other ships. And they said, it's not a problem, don't worry about it. In fact, was Cooper on board the Anderson worried about it? Not really. He actually went and took a nap. So when people tell me it must have been very harrowing for the Anderson, it was scary because they took a wave that came up and hit their lifeboat 35 feet above the water. And it damaged it. So we're talking about a massive wave. And the timing of that wave goes to about 7:10 when the Fitz went down. So significant. But Cooper was not in the pilot house when that last radio transmission came in. And basically the first mate asked him, how are you doing with your problems? And the Fitz said, we're holding our own. Here's the final route. As the 2 ships closed down, the Fitzgerald slowed down. It was a faster ship. Anderson was closing on the position, but still didn't come within 10 miles, more than 10 miles away. And they saw a snow squall come up, and they watched this blob on the radar. And all of a sudden, when the blob came back and they had visibility, the Fitz was gone. And so instantly they start calling, can we get somebody to help us? They start calling the Coast Guard. The closest is the Sioux, which is where they had one little tugboat sitting there called the Naugatuck. And the Naugatuck was their only option because the other ships were all down. Go ahead. Last call indicated that it could survive. That was the holding our own. Let's go and hit radio. Can you bring the audio level up? We'll show you the last radio transmissions, or actually when they're looking for the ship, because they have to convince the Anderson to come back. Can you get it okay? Or? Yep.
Is it right here? Ready to play?
Yeah. Suffered an oil line failure and was unable to leave until that next morning. The Coast Guard made a desperate plea to the Anderson to turn around and go back into the storm.
This is Roger, we have it. Is there no possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching for us? Yeah, I don't know. The stream out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going right back out that way.
Can you imagine that? He goes through the storm, he sees this massive freighter vanish, essentially within minutes, and now the Coast Guard's saying, turn around, would you please go out there? But quite honestly, that's the brotherhood of the sea. That's what these sailors do. And he made that call, flipped the ship around, but because the ship was going against the wind now, it was literally going against these 60-mile-an-hour winds. It took them until 2 a.m. to get out there. Now, Coast Guard had an airplane that came out and made it by 10 a.m., but that's 3 hours since the Fitz went down. So there was just no possibility, even if they had survival suits, it just didn't happen that anybody could be picked up. And again, we talked earlier about how this is significant. 1966, we had a survivor and we found most of the crew. 1958, we found 2 guys that survived overnight in a November storm. How is it that this ship vanished with 29 lives and we didn't find a single crewman? Just some life jackets, a spray bottle, some life rings, 2 life boats that were badly damaged, and that was it. And as these crew came through, the poor Coast Guard, the cutter Woodrush had to come all the way across Lake Superior, 24 hours through that storm, where the waves were washing over the ship with green water, and Captain Hobaugh brought it in, but there was nothing they could do. There was nothing left. And they finally saw a little bit of an oil slick. A plane flew over and located where with a submarine finding magnetometer. They found 2 pieces on the bottom and said that could possibly be the Edmund Fitzgerald. And they came out, did a side scan, and sure enough, the pieces matched up, but they had no idea what they looked like on the bottom. So in 1976, the Coast Guard came out and brought an underwater robot down called the Curve. Go ahead and hit your next button. And can we skip it or no?
Probably.
Just leave the volume down. This is Captain Hobaugh. He's talking about the storm, and I'll just kind of talk you through what he talks about, how these incredible waves that are hitting him. Now, he'd been on the ocean before, and he was talking about how the succession of waves would hit him from every angle. And most of the time, you would pitch or you would yaw in a storm on the ocean. At the Great Lakes, it was bouncing off the shore and hitting his ship in every direction. It was crazy. There was nothing they could do. And we've heard that so many times from different ships that have gone through these storms. In fact, in the 1913 storm, 1940 storm, the rudders on many of the freighters were actually either torn completely off or dislodged to where they couldn't steer. And once they turned sideways, they would roll over. Now, the Fitzgerald, there's no evidence to see that it went down any certain way. We do know that the bow section plowed in. We know that the stern section flipped over, and there's been a lot of talk about how it went down in one piece. And Pam, forgive me, as I talk about these things, I realize that it is of interest, but this is a grave site for people, and there's nobody, you know, we took a lot of hard knocks when we dove it because we found one of the missing crew. And I'll be honest with you, there's nothing more reverent than a shipwreck for me, because this is the connection that we have to go down there and actually do some kind of an investigation. So I'm thinking of Robert as I talk about this, but I also have to be matter of fact in the fact that there's so many clues